No longer do you have to ride the fader up and down so that the peaks and valleys of the vocal fit in the mix. The compressor will do this for you automatically. So let's talk about how to set a compressor for vocals. This video is brought to you by Behringer X32 Mastery, the fastest way for church sound techs to master the X32. And with a team license, you can enroll unlimited team members now and in the future. Finally, everyone will be on the same page. Visit x32.church or click the link in the description to learn more. Vocals have a wide dynamic range. They can sing really soft or really belted out. A compressor takes this wide range of volume and makes it as narrow as you want it to be. But keep in mind, dynamic range on a vocal is a good thing, so you don't want to cut it out too much, you simply want to make it manageable. When compression is set correctly, you'll reap all the benefits without any of the drawbacks. So let's go through the settings on a compressor one at a time and how to properly apply them to vocals. First up, let's talk about threshold. The threshold sets the height of the loudness ceiling. In other words, it decides how loud the signal has to be to activate the compressor. So if the threshold is set to -10 dB, it'll compress anything louder than -10 dB. If the signal is quieter than -10 dB, it'll remain untouched. For example, let's say that the threshold is set to -10 dB. If the signal from the vocal hits -6 dB, the compressor will activate and push the signal down according to the ratio. This is much like using the fader on the soundboard to bring the volume down on a singer's big note, but then bringing it back up when they begin to sing at a normal volume again. I can't give you an exact number for setting the threshold because every situation is different. However, I recommend setting the threshold so that the gain reduction meter rarely reads more than 6 dB. The gain reduction meter shows you how much the compressor is compressing the signal. So on vocals, I found that they begin to sound lifeless and overcompressed when compressing more than 6 dB. Now, let's talk about ratio. The ratio setting on a compressor decides how aggressive the compressor will respond. So a higher setting, like 12:1, will compress much more aggressively than a lower setting, like 3:1. When talking about a ratio of 3:1, you may be wondering what this figure actually means. Basically, for every 3 dB the signal exceeds the threshold, the compressor will allow a tolerance of 1 dB to pass through. For example, let's say the threshold is set to -6 dB and the ratio is 3:1. If the signal from the vocal hits -3 dB, then the compressor will allow up to -5 dB to pass through because of that 1 dB tolerance. If the signal from the vocal hits +3 dB, it's now 9 dB over our threshold of -6 dB. Since our 3:1 ratio allows 1 dB of tolerance for every 3 dB over the threshold, there's now a 3 dB tolerance. So up to -3 dB will be allowed to pass through the compressor. I could have just started out by giving you a ratio setting that works well for vocals, but it's important that you understand what's really going on. So if that just went over your head, rewind and watch that section again until it clicks. Now, I found that a good ratio for vocals is 3:1. If you go lower than that, you may not get the compression needed. If you go higher, the vocal will most likely end up sounding smashed. All right, next up, attack and release. The attack setting decides how much time it takes for the compressor to compress at full force. So a lower number like 5 milliseconds will cause the compressor to fully activate much more quickly than a higher number like 100 milliseconds. For vocals, you generally want this number to be low, between 5 milliseconds and 20 milliseconds. If the number's too high, the beginning syllables may come out too strong and sound a bit odd. The release setting on a compressor decides how much time it takes for the compressor to stop compressing. In other words, it's the amount of time the compressor stays active after being triggered. For a vocal, if the setting is too low, it will bounce back erratically and sound unnatural. If the setting is too high, the vocal will sound lifeless and overcompressed. You will most likely not want to set this longer than half a second. If the option is available, I've found that setting attack and release to auto works well for vocals. I recommend going this route with attack and release times to simplify the compression setting process. Keep in mind, you'll only want to use the auto setting on vocals. If compressing a snare or some other instrument, you'll want to set these manually to get the desired effect. All right, lastly, let's talk about output or gain. The output setting on a compressor does what you'd think. It adjusts the volume of the output. So if the gain reduction meter shows you that you're compressing the signal by 6 dB on average, you'll want to set the output to +6 dB to make up the difference. This brings the signal back to where you started, but with a smaller dynamic range. In other words, now the quieter moments are louder and the louder moments are quieter. All right, the next step for you is to get out and practice. I've put together a PDF download with sample compression settings to help you get started. Click the link in the description to get it. If you're using a digital soundboard, compression is most likely built in for each channel, so use what you've learned in this article to dial it in just right. Now, on a side note, if you have an analog soundboard, you're going to need to buy a compressor for each channel that you want to compress. A decent option is the Behringer MDX 2600. I'll include a link in the description where you can buy this.